get started here. All right, so let's just review what we're doing this week. Let me share my screen with you guys.
One time I catch her and bring it to the vet because she got bit by something, and I was just like, "This is I'm what I call it's in 12 to 16-hour bursts, and it actually so things do. I'm like,
sorry guys. Let me share my screen with you guys. Okay, so tonight and tomorrow night, we're doing Lukacs. So tomorrow night is one of our unfortunate abbreviated class sessions. So we'll start at 6:30 and end at 7:30. What we have left over to discuss there will carry over into Thursday. So the standpoint of the proletariat is actually longer than the phenomenon of reification that we read for tonight. However, some themes are very similar to, it's part 3 of the same essay that we're reading part 1 tonight. And so we might be able to cover it tomorrow night because of the themes in common, but if we don't entirely, then we'll carry that over to Thursday. And then Thursday, we'll be discussing Karl Korsch's essay, Marxism and Philosophy. And just to pace yourselves, that's an essay of almost 100 pages for Thursday. All right, so that's what we're doing tonight. The Lenin Karl Marx, I realized now when I was just logging on that it's possible that I did not know if that's provided here or not. Let me look in our file folder. That's a Marxist.org HTML resource. Let's see. Yeah, so let's look that up now. Oops. Okay, and I should have sent that as an announcement, so unfortunately I did not, but this is a supplemental reading. And so let me, that is not there.
yeah, right. Like see how.
I will send that link. I'll send you guys the link now. So that this is just a background supplemental reading for tonight, but also for all this week, for tonight and tomorrow night. So I realized I had not sent that. Ahead of class tonight. We'll see how much we might reference it. It's just some background for both Lukacs and the Korsch. And the preface, as I indicated on the syllabus, is not the 1967 preface, but the 1922 preface, the original preface, which we might also look that up now. Hold on. Right. Okay, because those are our little supplemental readings or additional readings in addition to the phenomenon of reification, the first part of the reification essay that we're reading from Lukacs. So let's start with some background on Lukacs. So Lukacs was someone who was an intellectual before he became a Marxist. He had already written and published books and many articles prior to his conversion to Marxism, which happened as a function of the Russian Revolution of 1917. So one of the things that we're going to catch up on today, ahead of this week, is the difference between Marx and Marxism. So if Marx is someone who came to consciousness in the 1840s, at the end of the First Industrial Revolution and during its crisis in the Hungry 1840s, then there is to be distinguished from Marx, and Marx with his friend and colleague and comrade Friedrich Engels, his best bud. They were not a movement. They were like a party of two, is sometimes how it's referred. Marxism, as a more influential ideology, and as an ideology within a mass movement, is a phenomenon of later history. It's really after Marx's own time. Engels outlives Marx by 12 years. Marx dies in 1883. Engels lives until 1895. Marxism really emerges in the period after Marx's life. Meaning, when did Marxism gain a great deal of ideological influence, and we might even say ideological hegemony, in the workers' movement for socialism, the broader workers' movement for socialism that predated Marx and Engels, that arose in the early 19th century in the context of the Industrial Revolution, and was broader than Marxism. But Marxism attained a certain ideological hegemony, a certain ideological political leadership within that workers' movement for socialism by the late 1800s, by the late 19th century. And really that's a function of what's known as the Second Industrial Revolution. So if Marx and Engels came to consciousness, and also we could say proletarian socialism, modern socialism, is a function of the Industrial Revolution, that first Industrial Revolution, 1750 to 1850. It only really produces a socialist movement in the latter half of that, coming out of the French Revolution. So in the aftermath of the French Revolution, the modern socialist movement develops during the first Industrial Revolution. But Marxism, as a political movement, is really a function of what's known as the Second Industrial Revolution. So the Second Industrial Revolution is conventionally dated 1871 to 1914. Has a different kind of dating. Dates from more political events than from more general social history or economic history. 1871, that's the year of the Paris Commune. It's the end of the Franco-Prussian War. 1914, the outbreak of World War I. So generally speaking, late 1800s, late 19th century, early 20th century, the period of the Second Industrial Revolution. So I want to say something about that in terms of geography. So there's time periods, but there's also geography. So if the first Industrial Revolution of 1750 to 1850 was geographically located, it began in Britain, spread to continental Europe as a function of the French Revolution, and the whole cycle of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the spread of the French Revolution throughout Europe. The Industrial Revolution came to Western Europe in that first phase, in the 1750 to 1850 phase, in the 1800 to 1850 phase, meaning it spread from England to France, the Netherlands, Belgium. It spread to Western Europe. And I mentioned this when we introduced Marx, that Marx and Engels are from the Rhineland. They're from the western part of Germany. They're from the part of Germany that was most affected by the French Revolution and by the Napoleonic Wars at a social and economic level, rather than thinking about it in political terms. Engels is from a factory-owning family, textile factory-owning family. The more industrialized part of Germany was the western part of Germany on the border with France. But generally, it's France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. It's the Benelux countries, as well as France, that are the second phase of the first industrial revolution. The second industrial revolution, however, and why it's dated by political events, it is a second phase of the Industrial Revolution. It has different technological components to it. The first Industrial Revolution is steam engine, steam power. Second Industrial Revolution is the electromagnetic revolution. It's electricity. Geographically, there are new countries that are rapidly industrialized in the late 1800s. And those are Germany, the United States, and Japan. Germany is a function of winning the Franco-Prussian War, defeating France in the War of 1870 to 71. Japan as a function of the Meiji Restoration, that's the defeat of the samurai by the emperor and the centralization of the state. And the American Civil War, the United States, after the North defeats the Southern Confederacy, the secessionists, abolishes slavery, that sets the conditions for a rapid industrialization of the United States. Germany, the defeat of France, is an occasion for the consolidation of the Prussian Empire over all of Germany and the centralization of the German state. So in France and England, it's associated with earlier revolutionary developments and really social and economic history. The Second Industrial Revolution comes out of these political events that allow for a unification of the country, a consolidation of the state, and the centralization of power. Also in the United States, there's a ability to more rapidly expand west after the slavery question is decided. So the big countries in the Second Industrial Revolution are the United States, Japan, and Germany, and their rise is what gives us early 20th century history. It gives us World War I and World War II. The rise of the United States, Germany, and Japan, as opposed to England and France, creates geopolitical problems, resulting ultimately in World War I and World War II. That is the period of the rise of the United States, Germany, and Japan, and also on a subordinate basis, but involved in this are the rise of the industrialization of Italy and Russia. It's not something that we normally think about, but Russia was the Russian Empire, which included Poland, the Baltic countries, and Finland. The western part of the Russian Empire, especially, but Western Russia more generally, anything west of Moscow, is part of this rapid industrialization. So Germany, Japan, the United States, centrally, Italy and Russia more peripherally, more subordinately. These are the countries of the Second Industrial Revolution. And it's the rise of those countries that really precipitate World War I and World War II. It's a function of the rise of the United States, especially, that the United States replaces the United Kingdom, Britain, as the preeminent capitalist power, preeminent capitalist country in the world. This Second Industrial Revolution sees the rise of mass socialist parties throughout the world, in France, in Italy, in Germany, in Russia. Also, to a certain extent in Japan, socialism gets started, but also a mass socialist party in the United States in the period before World War I. And it is as a function of this rapid industrialization. So this is when you have Marxism as a political ideology, as a mass political ideology. It's in the period of what's known as the Socialist or the Second International. So why is it the Second International? There was a First International. There was an International Working Men's Association. That was founded, and Karl Marx was part of that. Marx and Engels were part of that in the 1860s. But it didn't last very long. So it was founded in the context of working class solidarity and organizing in fraternity with the cause of the North in the American Civil War. The European countries wanted to intervene in the U.S. Civil War on the side of the South. Britain and France wanted to intervene on the side of the South. Why? Because the South provided cotton to European textile industry. So the Civil War disrupted that, so they were going to intervene. The North blockaded the South and prevented trade with the rest of the world, prevented the cotton trade, which supplied European textile industry. They ultimately did not directly intervene. They almost did. They came very close to doing so. There was an expedition in Mexico to invade and intervene in the U.S. Civil War from the South. But they were defeated. That was the Mexican Empire, was defeated by the Mexican Republicans at the Battle of Puebla, which is celebrated as Cinco de Mayo. The First International was organized around that because workers in Europe who were being laid off because their factories were idle, because there was no cotton to process, did not go along with their government's desire to intervene on the side of the South, but instead took the cause of the North, the abolitionist cause, as an occasion for their own radicalization and for their own organizing. That produced, because it took place in multiple countries, the First International, the International Working Men's Association, including workers in the northern United States, in the northern states. Marx and Engels were part of that, but that First International broke up because of a split between Marx and Engels and their followers and the anarchists. So that's a whole other story that we won't get deeply into. Proudhon, it was towards the end of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's life, the figure that we encountered in the early writings by Marx in the letter to Ruga from 1843 and in the 1844 manuscripts, as well as we read a passage from Marx's published major critique of Proudhon, that's The Poverty of Philosophy from 1847. We read The Coming Upheaval in that. But I don't think Proudhon is targeted especially there. But really it's a second wave of anarchism. So the big antagonist of Marx in the First International is Mikhail Bakunin. Bakunin, who was actually a fan of Marx's, but had a falling out with him. He translated the Russian anarchist, he translated the Communist Manifesto into Russian, and he started translating Das Kapital into Russian until he had his falling out with Marx. That's the First International. It lasted up through the Paris Commune of 1871. That's the uprising of the Parisian workers and others. At the end of the Franco-Prussian War, when the French government was going to surrender Paris to the invading Germans, the city of Paris rose up against that. and they established an independent municipal government that was organized on radical democratic lines, and that's what's known as the Paris Commune. And commune in this context just means the commune of Paris. It just means the city of Paris. Municipal government is called the commune in France. So even today, municipal government of Paris is the commune of Paris. But the Paris Commune as a historical event is attached to the socialist movement. And there were socialists involved in it. The First International survives a little bit after that, but really falls apart. The Second International was established in 1889 on the centenary, on the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution of 1789. The preeminent party of the Second International, the Socialist International, is the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany. That's where the Marxist theorists are, and they're mentioned by Lukacs, and we will see by Korsch in the reading for Thursday. Karl Kautsky, is known as the Pope of Marxism. He's the sort of main theorist of the Second International as a Marxist. He writes a great deal. And Eduard Bernstein, who is the great heretic of the Second International, who's known as the revisionist, the capital R revisionist, and as a reformist. So what is that about? In the 1890s, after Engels died, Bernstein starts writing articles, which he compiles into a book called Evolutionary Socialism, where he says that it looks like there won't be a revolution the way that there had been previously in 1848 or in the Paris Commune of 1871, with a lot of street fighting and a kind of military-style insurrection. It looks like, rather, the working class is going to come to power more peacefully through the vote, through political means. And that liberal democracy, a liberal democratic republic, like existed in France or the United States, or really the constitutional monarchy of the UK, is essentially a liberal democratic republic, that in the advanced capitalist countries that are already liberal democratic republics, that the working class can gradually assert itself as a numerical majority politically and take power that way and start to reform capitalism into socialism. And that was already happening through the growth of the workers' movement, the growth of the union, the labor union movement, through the kinds of reforms that the state was undertaking in the face of this mass working class movement, but also in response to the conditions of industrial production. He left open, of course, the possibility that more insurrectionary revolutions might be necessary in places like Germany, where he was from, because they did not have a liberal democratic republic, but were still autocratic, absolute monarchies. But in places like France, Britain, the United States, perhaps it could go another way. This is seen as reformism and revisionism. So when you encounter these words, this is what it refers to, a revision of Marxism. Away from the idea of the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat that Marx had spelled out, that we read in his letter to Wedemeyer from 1852 on, he says that Marx said to his publisher, he didn't discover the class struggle, he didn't discover either the existence of classes nor the class struggle between them. What he discovered was the historical necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The big revision of Marxism that was floated in the late 1800s was that perhaps socialism could be achieved without that dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, we didn't read a lot about that in Marx's own writings. However, it is spelled out in the Lenin piece, in the Karl Marx encyclopedia entry that Lenin wrote before the Russian Revolution, before World War I, actually, for a Russian encyclopedia. Okay. So, the Second International went into a crisis and split around World War I. But its crisis and its split was different from the controversy that had taken place within it almost 20 years earlier, known as the revisionist dispute. So this dispute over whether these mass socialist parties were really organizing towards the dictatorship of the proletariat or whether they were organizing as more ordinary electoral parties, albeit connected to a mass social movement, labor organizing, but also other forms of working class collective organizing. So they had women's organizations, social clubs, athletic leagues, musical societies. They had all sorts of kind of subcultural and countercultural organization of the working class, underpinning these political parties that stood in elections, but when they were elected to Parliament or the Reichstag in Germany, they were the party of intransigent opposition. They voted no on everything. They voted against everything. But they gave big speeches in order to propagandize socialism without taking part in governing prior to World War I. So that was the reformist or the revisionist dispute as to whether they were going to stick to the orthodox perspective of the dictatorship of the proletariat or whether they were going to revise that political strategy and draw the theoretical conclusions from that about the nature of capitalism, how it can be changed, and how it can be changed politically. World War I introduced a new crisis, a new controversy within the Second or Socialist International. And that was the question of war itself. That was the question of the war among the great capitalist powers, or what they called an inter-imperialist war. A war between the empires, between the British Empire and the French Empire on one side, and also allied with the Russian Empire, against the German Empire, the Prussian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, their allies, and the Ottoman Empire, also their allies. So the Central Powers versus the Entente, and with the United States staying out of World War I, but eventually getting involved at the end, and on the side of the British and the French and the Russians, against the Central Powers, the Germans, the Austrians, and the Ottoman Empire. They had anticipated, the socialists, the Marxists had anticipated the war. They saw it coming on the horizon. There were various international crises before World War I that seemed to suggest the possibility, and there was an arms race that suggested the possibility of an international war. And they even anticipated that it would be massively destructive in the way that it was, the way it turned out to be. They had promised, all the parties of the Second International, they had promised that they would launch a revolution to stop such a war, that they would launch a civil war to stop the international war that they saw coming in capitalism. That didn't happen, however. What happened instead was that, generally speaking, the parties of the Second International, the Socialist International, lined up with their respective capitalist governments in the war. So the German socialists supported the German government, the French socialists supported the French government. Less so, but even so, the British socialists supported the British government. An exception to this, or the exceptions to this, were the Russian socialists were against the war, and the American socialists were against the war as well. That really divides the Second International. One of the characters who's mentioned by Lukacs, but also will be mentioned by Korsch, is Rosa Luxemburg. She's a very important Marxist intellectual who's active in 3 countries in the Second or Socialist International. She is Polish. Poland was divided between Germany, Russia, and Austria. She's from the Russian part of Poland. She participates in a Polish Social Democratic Labor Party that is about the part of Poland in Russia. That's part of the Russian Empire. She helps organize that party. As such, she's also part of the Russian Socialist Party, Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, with Lenin. She's also, however, living in exile in Germany, and so she participates in the German Social Democratic Party, the SPD. She declares the Second International dead when World War I breaks out, and there is no revolutionary struggle to try to stop it. So there's a crisis of the Socialist International. That crisis leads to a falling out among socialists around the Russian Revolution. So all the countries that lost in World War I experienced a revolution. So Russia was defeated by Germany and her allies. There was a Russian Revolution in 1917. Germany, however, loses the war against the Entente, against Britain, France, and the United States in 1918. There's a revolution in Germany. Austria-Hungary loses and falls apart, and they have a Hungarian Revolution in 1919, and there's also an uprising in Vienna in Austria. The Ottoman Empire has a Turkish nationalist revolution, Ataturk. The Hungarian Revolution of 1919, Georg Lukacs participates in. He participates as a minister of culture in the Hungarian Soviet, or Workers' Council Republic of 1919. Short-lived, however. So outside of Russia, these revolutions fail. The Ottoman collapse, the Turkish nationalist revolution succeeds. There is also a radicalization in Italy among the socialists there, because Italy is frustrated in its war. It's on the side of the Entente, it's on the side of Britain, France, Russia, and the United States, but it does not achieve its war aims. And so it experiences a political crisis at the end of World War I as well. But that division in Italian socialism as a function of World War I actually gives rise to fascism, because Benito Mussolini was a leading Italian socialist, a Marxist, but he invents a new ideology that he calls fascism, based on the principles of the ancient Roman Republic and Roman Empire, that he sets out to be more radical than Marxism, more revolutionary than Marxism, more radical than Marxism. That's a separate story. More generally, there's a division between that second Socialist International and a new third or Communist International over the Russian Revolution and the path of the revolutions that come in its wake in Germany and Hungary, and also Italy. Should they take the path of the Bolsheviks, of Lenin, in the Russian Revolution and try to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat, or should they aim for a reform of the capitalist state, the Weimar Republic that comes out of German defeat in World War I? So there's a division between the Social Democrats, or the Socialists, and the Communists. And that all comes out of their division over the Russian Revolution of 1917. Lukacs is on the communist side. He joins the Communist International. He's a part of the Hungarian Communist Party. He participates in the Hungarian Workers' Council, or Soviet Republic, of 1919. What was he before World War I? Before World War I, he's a literary critic, a philosopher, a social thinker. Before World War I, he was a post-Marxist, meaning he was aware of Marxism. He liked Marx's writings. He thought Marx was brilliant, but he thought it was out of date, antiquated. And he disagreed with Marxism politically. He thought it was stuck in the 1800s, stuck in the 19th century. And he did not agree with the program of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The Russian Revolution changed his mind about that. That made Marxism, in its orthodox strategy of the dictatorship of the proletariat, seem viable. So he joined up. He and Korsch have similar histories this way. They were not Marxists until the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution converts them to orthodox Marxism. And what we're reading this week is their attempt to make sense of Marxism that they've joined up with. So their attraction to Marxism is in its radicalism, in its depth of its theory, and also in its far-reaching political vision. So what we'll be reading are writings by Georg Lukacs and Karl Korsch that are trying to explain their understanding of Marxism. And they're getting that from going back and rereading Marx closely, Marx and Engels, but also from taking cues from Lenin and from Rosa Luxemburg. So Lukacs is Hungarian, but he's really intellectually active in Germany. Rosa Luxemburg is a major figure in her own right, but especially in the German movement. She's internationally known, but especially in the German movement. So Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin, their understanding of Marxism and how they understood the crisis of Marxism, both in its revisionist, reformist phase of Eduard Bernstein in the early 20th century, the reformism versus revolution controversy, but also in the context of World War I and the Russian Revolution. Because both Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg participated in the founding of the Third International, the Communist International, out of the crisis of the Second International. Okay, so I will also say about Lukacs and Korsch, they're writing in the aftermath of these revolutions. There was a revolutionary wave, a revolutionary crisis that continued from 1917 to 1918 and 1919, but also into 1920, 21, 22. By the time they're writing, they think they're still writing in the context of a revolutionary wave, but in fact it's already started to ebb. It's already started to wane. So there's also a quality of taking stock, summing up the experience, and digesting the essential lessons of this revolutionary crisis of Marxism that had taken place, and that had revealed a new kind of radical core to Marxism that otherwise seemed hidden under a kind of 19th century, 1800s kind of antiquated veneer. Okay, so one way of thinking about that is to look at the preface both to the book History and Class Consciousness, but also the beginning of what we read for tonight, The Phenomenon of Reification by Lukacs. So what I'd like to do is start with the first paragraph of The Phenomenon of Reification in the Consciousness of the Proletariat. It comes before the beginning of section 1, The Phenomenon of Reification. And we'll see how Lukacs explains himself at the beginning of this essay. So this book, History and Class Consciousness, published in 1923, compiled in 1922. It is a selection of his essays written from 1919 to 1922, with 2 new essays written especially for the book, one being the centerpiece of the book, and that is the Reification and the Consciousness of the Proletariat. We're reading part 1 tonight, and we'll read part 3 tomorrow. So we're reading the beginning, and we'll read the conclusion. Let's see what he says in the beginning of the Reification and the Consciousness of the Proletariat. He says, to be radical, he quotes Marx from Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. To be radical is to go to the root of the matter. For man, however, the root is man himself. Now, we'll see that at the end of this phenomenon of reification, we have a similar thought figure, which is the turtles all the way down. It's what's known in philosophy as turtles all the way down paradox, meaning to get to the root of the matter, and the root is man himself, but then it's turtles all the way down. You never get to the bottom. Is to say that to be radical is to go to the root of the matter, and for man, however, the root is man himself, that there's a self-reflexive, self-critical character to this radicalism that he is going to embark upon. And then he writes, it is no accident that Marx should have begun with an analysis of commodities when in the 2 great works of his mature period, he set out to portray capitalist society in its totality and to lay bare its fundamental nature. For at this stage in the history of mankind, there is no problem that does not ultimately lead back to that question, and there is no solution that could not be found in the solution to the riddle of the commodity structure. So, commodity structure, commodity form, that's the term that we've used. Of course, the problem can only be discussed with this degree of generality if it achieves the depth and breadth to be found in Marx's own analyses. That is to say, the problem of commodities must not be considered in isolation, or even regarded as the central problem in economics, but rather as the central structural problem of capitalist society in all its aspects. Only in this case can the structure of commodity relations be made to yield a model of all the objective forms of bourgeois society together with all the subjective forms corresponding to them. So the issue is both objective and subjective. And then we will see what the relation between the objective and the subjective is. We'll see especially that it has to do with reification as a kind of objectification, but a kind of objectification that he calls a phantom-like objectivity. We could also call it an alienated objectivity, so reification. So what is this term reification? So reification in the Consciousness of the Proletariat, the title of this essay that we're reading the first part tonight. First of all, reification. Reification means thingification, to turn something into a thing. Especially to turn a process into a thing. Reification in the Consciousness of the Proletariat, it might seem to be setting up, the problem is reification, and then the answer or the solution is the consciousness of the proletariat. So reification is the question and the problem, and the consciousness of the proletariat is the answer and the solution. Actually, no. Rather, how the consciousness of the proletariat is a function of reification. We encountered this in Adorno's letter to Benjamin that I invoked when we were reading the Fetishism of Commodities section of Chapter 1 of Volume 1 of Das Kapital by Marx. That commodity fetishism, or the fetishism of commodities, is not a fact of consciousness, but rather produces consciousness. we will see that reification is a way that Lukacs tries to address the fetishism of commodities, or commodity fetishism. So in that respect, the consciousness of the proletariat is a function of reification itself. It's not the solution or the answer to it, it's part of the problem. It's part of the question of reification itself, both objectively and subjectively. So it's objective and subjective in character, and we'll see what that has to do with. Now, this is the central essay written newly for the book, titled History and Class Consciousness. Something similar is going on there. Namely, it's not history. Okay, what is the trajectory of history? What is the question of history? What is the task of history? What's the problem of history? And then class consciousness, or proletarian class consciousness, is the answer or the solution to history. It would seem like that's what he's saying. The solution to the riddle of the commodity structure, is that proletarian class consciousness? Okay, so actually what he's indicating here by this title, and we'll see in the substance of his essays, that class consciousness is historical consciousness, or it's consciousness of history. In other words, the class consciousness of the proletariat is a consciousness of its historical mission, its historical task, its historical vocation. Meaning, what is the role of the proletariat in history? And what is the role of the proletariat's consciousness in history? Alright, so I mentioned reification and subjective and objective. It's actually a chart that I've made for us to use. And that is to help explain, it's the chart on reification to help explain this concept of reification. I'll link it in an announcement after class tonight, but let's look at it together now. So this takes us back to some things that we talked about when we were reading Kant. And then we also returned to it when we were discussing Hegel and the early Marx, especially the Marx of the 1844 manuscripts. Okay, so the phenomenon of reification, when we looked at the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena, the phenomenon of reification means the appearance, or the semblance, but really the appearance of reification. How does this reification, whatever that might be, how does it appear? And how do we know it? How do we know its substance? Hegel's maxim, the essence must appear. How do we know the substance of reification? Through its appearance. So let's define reification, first of all, and then we'll be thinking about how it appears. So first of all, we have to start with what reification represents with regard to subjective and objective factors, the subjective and the objective. So here, it goes back to Kant and Hegel, subject and object. The dialectic of subject and object. So what's meant by this? It means that subject and object don't exist apart from each other, they only exist in tandem. So there's a reciprocal relation and a mutual mediation, this is the language that Lukacs uses, between subject and object. So what does that mean? It means that the subject mediates the object, and the object mediates the subject. In Kant's description of this, that's also taken up by Hegel and then by Marx, we don't know the world in itself, we don't know things in themselves, nor do we know the world in itself. We only know things, we only know the world as objects. So the thing in itself becomes an object. the thing becomes an object, or the world, the universe. Kant described it as the sensuous manifold, the flux of matter and energy in which in itself time and space don't exist. We make of that flux of matter and energy objects. How do we do so? In our social relations, in our bourgeois social relations, in our bourgeois social relations of labor, meaning it's in our practical interaction with the world that things in themselves become objects. They become practical objects and theoretical objects. Right, so others, nature, and even ourselves become objects for ourselves, become objects to us, become theoretical and practical objects. So how and why is that the case? I mentioned that Marx described the Hegelian dialectics and the metaphysics of the Hegelian dialectic as a metaphysics of labor. So in what way? Well, the account here, and by Hegel he meant Kant and Hegel, a subject and object only exist in tandem with each other. Meaning, by objectifying through a process of objectification of things, that is how the subject comes into being. So the subject is produced by a process of objectification. Lukacs uses some very specific and obscure, to us potentially, philosophical language. He calls it objectification, we know objectification. Subjectification. So not just making something into an object, but making something a subject. Becoming a subject. Also, objectivation. What does objectivation mean? To objectivate. It means to make something objective, as opposed to subjective. To make something subjective is a process of subjectivation. To subjectivate is to make something subjective in character. Hegel described this, and Marx in the 1844 manuscripts follows Hegel in this language, that objectification, objectivation, is a function of externalization. In other words, in our theoretical and practical activity, we externalize ourselves in the object. We externalize ourselves in the objective realm. And it's in doing that, in externalizing ourselves, that we actually become subjects. That we subjectivate things and we subjectify them. In so doing, in the subject becoming a subject, in constituting oneself, or in constituting itself, the subject internalizes the object. So there's an externalization of the subject in the object, and there's an internalization of the object in the subject. That's what makes it a mutual mediation, a reciprocal relation, and a dialectical relation of subject and object. However, so again, this is a bourgeois dialectic of labor. So again, Marx considers this to be what happens in bourgeois social relations. So maybe this wouldn't apply to religious social relations, but only to the social relations of labor. So in religious social relations, we relate to others, to nature, and to ourselves through religious morality and through a relation to the divine. So we are divine creations relating to other divine creations. That's a religious cosmology. That's religious social relations. In bourgeois social relations, by contrast, our relations to others, to nature, and to ourselves is a function of labor. Labor is our essential social relation. And that takes this character of subject and object. I mentioned that John Locke, who Marx agrees with, considers property, the right to property, property in things, objects that are property. It's because they are an externalization of labor. So someone can claim something as one's property if one's labor is mixed in it. In other words, if one has externalized oneself in the object, and in that way made the object part of oneself. The idea here is that in capitalism, these bourgeois social relations disintegrate. So this dialectic of subject and object breaks down, and this reciprocal relation or mutual mediation of subject and object through labor, through the process of labor, through the process of externalization and internalization through labor. It breaks down and it disintegrates. So subject and object become split off from each other, disintegrates, and the object reverts to a thing. So the object reverts back to a thing, and that's what reification refers to. It refers to a thingification of objects. So where the object has been constituted by us as subjects, but it has a phantom-like objectivity. It eludes us how we are externalized in the object and how the object is internalized in us. The object becomes alienated from us. And in that way, we become self-alienated. So if you remember the 4 dimensions of alienation that Marx laid out in the 1844 manuscripts, which, by the way, Lukacs got all of this without having access to the 1844 manuscripts. He derived this from Marx's other writings. The 1844 manuscripts had not yet been published. The 4 dimensions of alienation, according to Marx in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, are our alienation from each other in society, our alienation from nature, and our alienation from ourselves. Now, how does that happen? Well, because we are alienated from our own labor, and that's the 4th dimension. We're alienated from the product or the result of our own labor. And in that respect, the product or result of our labor, if you recall from the 1844 manuscripts, there are 2 products of labor, or 2 results of labor. One is an article of consumption, a working up of nature, a metabolism of nature, an article of consumption. The other is a social relation produced by labor. That's what we're alienated from. We're not really alienated from the articles of consumption, the material, concrete product of our labor. We're not really alienated from that any more than we're alienated from any other object. What we're essentially alienated from is from our own activity and from our own social relations, from our own labor. And that is the result of alienating us from each other, from nature, and from ourselves. This alienated subjectivity, he calls Lukacs reified consciousness, which he describes as thing-like subjectivity, where our own subjectivity becomes thing-like to ourselves. The corollary being how the objects that we are connected to elude us with a phantom-like objectivity and seem to be not really objects that we are integrally relating to, but rather things outside of us. And he calls that contemplation, or a contemplative stance, a contemplative attitude, meaning where the objects are objects of contemplation rather than objects of practical action. That we're divorced from them. They seem to elude us. Our practice, our practical relation to them is uncertain. We are alienated from it. Our own subjectivity is therefore alien from us. That's reification. It's a phenomenon or appearance of what happens to bourgeois social relations, the social relations of labor, the relations between people, with nature and with ourselves, appears alienated, and it takes the appearance, the form of appearance, it manifests as phenomena of reification. So it's subjective and objective. It has a structuring character to it. It has a formal character to it. But it affects the substance, the content of things. Okay. And that this is a historically specific phenomenon, meaning this is something that really manifested in the capitalist era, in the industrial era. So it's a self-contradiction and crisis of the bourgeois social relations of labor. The manifestation, the appearance or phenomenon of this crisis is reification. And reification shows up in all domains of life. All, he means it, all the subjective and objective forms of bourgeois society. So it doesn't only affect factory laborers, it doesn't only affect the proletariat, meaning the working class under proletarianized conditions of production, capitalism, but shows up also in the bourgeois professions. And those are the examples that he mostly concentrates on. So he talks about the emergence of capitalism. He talks about the emergence of bourgeois society and of capitalism. There's a way that this first part of the reification essay, the phenomenon of reification, serves to both review and also summarize things that we did not read, review what we did read, and summarize things that we did not read from Marx's Critique of Political Economy, from Das Kapital and the Grundrisse and other writings. The two mature works that he refers to are Das Kapital and the Theories of Surplus Value. I think that's the second one that he's referring to. He's definitely referring to Das Kapital. In terms of the emergence of bourgeois society and then the emergence of industrial capitalism, and how reification is a function of that. So what you'll see is that reification really takes hold in the late 1800s, in the second half of the 19th century. So after the first Industrial Revolution was completed, and in the context of the Second Industrial Revolution, that's when reification really takes hold. And he's got many examples of those. He has journalism as an example. Why is that? Because we want something contradictory out of journalism. We want just the facts. We want objective reporting. But we also want subjective interpretation and opinion from journalists. So we want something that appears contradictory to us. We want something objective, but we also want something subjective. We want them to digest and interpret things for us and not just report facts. But we also want them to report facts objectively. So in an earlier time, subject and object would not have seemed to be so split, where the objective and the subjective are antagonistic or opposed to each other. It would have seemed like, okay, this is someone who, from their point of view, is reporting the facts as they see them. And then the reader of journalistic accounts can try to make sense of things by relating to the subjective point of view of the journalist. You could still get an objective account. You could still get a reporting of the facts, while also dealing with the subjective perspective of the journalist. Whereas now it seems like these are two completely different things that interfere with each other. Whereas, of course, there is no reporting of the facts that's possible without a subjective point of view. Just as obviously there's no subjectivity without objective facts, without objective data. Like you have to have a subjective point of view on something. So the subject doesn't exist without the object. The object doesn't exist without the subject. Without the subject, there would just be a flux of matter and energy without even space or time as meaningful categories. That all of those, making an object out of a thing, experiencing it as existing in space and time, those are all because of the subject perceiving it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be such an object in itself. It's one example. Another example is bureaucracy. What does that mean? It means the rule of the bureaus. And what are the bureaus? The bureaus of experts. So the rule of experts, the rule of technocratic experts, the rule of specialized professional experts in various fields who have experience, knowledge, wisdom about things in their specialized field and therefore are given a certain amount of authority. But such bureaucratic expertise, mobilized as a governing and administrative force, tends to take on a life of its own, and bureaucracy doesn't serve society through specialized expertise so much as it becomes an end in itself. So the problem of bureaucracy that we are aware of. That it's not just specialized people who in the division of labor are helpful, but they also kind of arrogate a role to themselves, where it's unclear whether they're just trying to maintain their positions as bureaucrats or whether they're actually exercising their expertise. Another example would be law. So again, law, it's not just about facts, it's about adjudicating the facts. It's about making judgments. It's about conflicting points of view. It's about judging people who might have equal claims, or as Marx puts it, where right meets right, force will decide. Force of law. So law is inevitably subjective in its application, and yet what we want from the law is some kind of predictable result. We want it to function more objectively, even though we know it's about judgments. We know it's about weighing counterclaims against each other. And he describes that controversy in law as the controversy between positive law and natural law. This is actually a long-standing, it still exists. It's still a controversy in the realm of law. Positive law, meaning, are we making these judgments on the basis of reason? Are we just making logical analyses and applying reason and making judgments that way? That's positive law. Or is it natural law? In which case we're making judgments based on custom, experience, tradition, precedent. So are we applying the law just using our reason, positive law, or are we applying the law based on historical precedent and custom and tradition, natural law? Well, of course, we're supposed to be doing both, and yet they appear to be opposed to each other. And then finally, we talked about history. So the class consciousness of the proletariat, proletarian class consciousness, is historical consciousness. It's consciousness of history. History itself becomes subject to reification. History is also where there's the appearance or phenomenon of reification. And he describes this in terms of historicism. We'll come back to this also in the third part of the essay that we will be reading for tomorrow night. Historicism, meaning again, history. Should history be objective, or is history inevitably subjective? And what is the relation between the subjective and the objective in historiography, in the writing of history, in the recording of history, in the digestion and interpretation of history, in the account of history. Historicism being a phenomenon of this reification in which there's a desire, a kind of an impossible desire, to capture the past as it actually was, to capture it objectively, and to try to screen out any subjective bias, especially the subjective bias of the present, which, looking back on the past. So this actually vitiates or negates history itself, because history is not the past. History is the meaning of the past for the present. So what Hegel was talking about in the introduction to the philosophy of history. History is not the past, it's how we're relating to the past in the present, and therefore what the past means to us in the present. So we're in a conundrum there. What do we want when we're looking at the past? Are we looking at its meaningfulness for us now, or are we looking for objectively what actually happened, suspended of all judgments we might bring from the present? And is that even possible? So the self-contradiction that appears as a reification, as the problem of reification, shows up in all sorts of domains. Also shows up in the labor process, but also in the class struggle of the working class itself. This is going to be more what we discuss tomorrow night. So if the consciousness of the proletariat is not opposed to reification, but rather a function of reification, if commodity fetishism produces consciousness, rather than just being a fact of consciousness, then how are we going to work through reification? How are we going to approach reification as self-contradictory in a way that might point beyond itself? And this is especially the case with respect to the consciousness of the working class, or proletarian class consciousness. It's bound up with reification. It's inseparable from reification. It's a function of capitalism. It's a function of capitalist contradiction itself. And so the working class's own consciousness is not the answer or the solution to capitalism, but is itself a phenomenon of capitalism, is itself an expression of the contradiction of capitalism. How so? We were talking about this last week. Bourgeois ideology. Also bourgeois ideology as false consciousness. False consciousness. Let's see what Lukacs has to say about this in the preface to History and Class Consciousness, because that's really the core part of the preface that I wanted to look at. So I'll share my screen with you guys so we can read this together. So he says the collection and publication of these essays in book form is not intended to give them a greater importance as a whole than would be due to each individually. For the most part, they are attempts arising out of actual work for the party to clarify the theoretical problems of the revolutionary movement in the mind of the author and his readers. The exceptions to this are the two essays, Reification and the Consciousness of the Proletariat, and Towards a Methodology of the Problem of Organization, which were both written especially for this collection. Let me jump ahead here. A few words of explanation, superfluous for many readers perhaps, are due for the prominence given in these pages to the presentation, interpretation, and discussion of Rosa Luxemburg. So he explains that he considers her very central and as on par with Lenin. And then he says, once we take this path, we discover the writings and speeches of Lenin become crucial, methodologically speaking. It is not our intention to concern ourselves here with Lenin's political achievements, but just because our task is consciously one-sided and limited, it is essential that we remind ourselves constantly of Lenin's importance as a theoretician for the development of Marxism. can jump ahead here. Then he says, he believes that all good Marxists should form, in Lenin's words, a kind of society of the materialist friends of the Hegelian dialectic. So what is that about? It's really about what Lukacs and Korsch have in common. Both of these writers will be addressing this week, which is that they discover the revolutionary and radical aspect of Marxism in its Hegelian dimension that might be neglected through an interpretation of Marxism as materialist, namely the idealist dimension of Marxism that's connected with its radical and revolutionary character. So, again, in Lenin's words, a kind of society for the materialist friends of the Hegelian dialectic. But he says, immediately after that, but Hegel's position today is the reverse of Marx's own. The problem with Marx is precisely to take his method and his system as we find them and to demonstrate that they form a coherent unity that must be preserved. He says the opposite is true of Hegel. The task he imposes is to separate out from the complex web of ideas, with its sometimes glaring contradictions, all the seminal elements of his thought and rescue them as a vital intellectual force for the present. Right, so he says we cannot take the system as we have it, Hegel's system, belongs to the past. Even this statement concedes too much. For, he says, in my view, a really incisive critic would have to conclude that he had to deal not with the authentically organic and coherent system, but with a number of overlapping systems. And if you recall, this is a problem that Marx addressed in To Make the World Philosophical, the excerpt from his dissertation, where he said that Hegel's followers have to deal with a ready-made system, whereas for Hegel it was not a ready-made system, but something that he was working through himself. And that as such, as a ready-made system, for the followers of Hegel, it sort of falls apart. He says discussions of this kind contained in these pages have the inevitable defect that they fail to fulfill the justifiable demand for a completely systematic theory without offering any compensation in the way of popularity. He says, I am only too aware of this failing. This account of the genesis and aim of these essays is offered less as an apology than as a stimulus, and this is the true aim of this work, to make the problem of dialectical method the focus of discussion as an urgent living problem. So if we have to rescue Hegel's method, the dialectic, from his system, then what does it mean to rescue the dialectic? If these essays, he writes, provide the beginning, or even just the occasion, for a genuinely profitable discussion of dialectical method, if they succeed in making dialectics generally known again, they will have fulfilled their function perfectly. He says, while dwelling on such shortcomings, I should perhaps point out to the reader unfamiliar with dialectics one difficulty inherent in the nature of dialectical method relating to the definition of concepts and terminology. It is of the essence of dialectical method that concepts which are false in their abstract one-sidedness are later transcended. The process of transcendence makes it inevitable that we should operate with these one-sided abstract and false concepts. These concepts acquire their true meaning less by definition than by their function as aspects that are then transcended in the totality. Moreover, it is even more difficult to establish fixed meanings for concepts in Marx's improved version of the dialectic than in the Hegelian original. For if concepts are only the intellectual forms of historical realities, then these forms, one-sided, abstract, and false as they are, belong to the true unity as genuine aspects of it. Hegel's statements about this problem of terminology in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit are thus even more true than Hegel himself realized when he said, quote, just as the expression unity of subject and object, of finite and infinite, of being and thought, etc., have the drawbacks that object and subject bear the same meaning as when they exist outside that unity, so that within the unity they remain something other than is implied by their expression, so too falsehood is not, as false, any longer a moment of truth. In the pure historicization of the dialectic, Lukacs continues, this statement receives yet another twist. Insofar as the false is an aspect of the true, it is both false and non-false. Right, so, and then continuing, he says, the logical conclusion for the dialectician to draw from this failure, the failure to follow the dialectical meaning of terms, is not that he is faced with a conflict between different scientific methods, dialectical and non-dialectical, but that he is in the presence of a social phenomenon, and that by conceiving it as a social historical phenomenon, he can at once refute it and transcend it dialectically. Meaning, the controversy between dialectics and non-dialectics is itself a historical phenomenon, is itself a historical symptom, itself has to be addressed dialectically. Okay, so to get back to the point that I was raising earlier about bourgeois ideology, false consciousness, the issue is the truth of the false. And what do we mean by false? If we go back to the first week, to our first class session, Robert Pippin's essay on critical theory, where the falseness not just of ideas, but of everyday life itself, of the ordinary in itself, that the falseness isn't simply about wrong ideas, but is about contradiction. Meaning, false consciousness is true consciousness insofar as it's the truth of contradiction. Meaning, false consciousness is contradictory consciousness, and the only reason to treat it as false, since it's our reality now, is to not assume its permanence, to understand that it is to be transcended, it is to be overcome. Meaning, it's only false if we treat it as eternal. It's true if we see it as part of an unfolding historical process. So even categories in their one-sidedness as false lose their falseness when understood as part of a process of history when approached dialectically. And that's what he's going to do with reification, and we'll see tonight and tomorrow night alienation. So alienation, which just sounds negative, sounds like something bad that we should try to eliminate, he's going to approach through the phenomenon of reification as something that needs to be worked through dialectically, meaning alienation is self-contradictory. Alienation is not a dead end. It's not just a bad situation we find ourselves in. But alienation is something that we have to overcome, and we can only overcome it by working through it. In other words, to approach alienation dialectically. In this instance, how alienation appears through the various phenomena of reification. And therefore how reification is not just a bad situation, not a dead end, but something that points beyond itself through its self-contradictory character. So again, subject and object. Reification is a breakdown of the relation of subject and object, but the relation of subject and object is still there. It's not totally broken. It's still there, even if it has become paradoxical, alienated, obscure to itself, mystified, alienated. Alright, sorry for that very long introduction. This will also help us with not only the reading for tomorrow, but also for Thursday from Korsch. Let's take a short break now, and then we'll come back and get into the text via the notes that you guys posted to the discussion thread. So just let's take 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, let's resume. All right. All right, we've got notes posted by Cato. Or Cato.
Yeah, that's fine.
Hello. Hi.
Hi. Yeah, so I just kind of put a progression of quotes that I thought followed a certain train of thought that I identified and I found helpful in understanding like the connection between capitalist rationalization and reification. Do you want me to read all of it or just kind of explain the overall? Yeah, I did put a lot. I'm sorry.
No, it's good. So let's look at this. So the first thing that you call attention to is rationalization. What did you make of that?
I thought that kind of continued on a lot of what we've been reading, like the kind of obsession of capitalism to rationalize and calculate every aspect of like the worker, especially, and like the mechanization of labor and the increased specialization and productivity, and how that relates to the worker, how it affects kind of the worker's soul, and that the very being of workers is reduced in the capitalist system to these kind of statistical concepts. And then how that rationalization kind of creates the appearance of human qualities as error rather than just human qualities, I guess. So
right, the qualitative becomes a kind of error from the standpoint of what he calls quantification. That's a phenomenon of what he's calling rationalization. So rationalization, let me just say something about this. So this is actually an idea from Max Weber, who's a German sociologist, Weber, Max Weber. And Lukacs was an acolyte of his before he converted to Marxism. And Weber was a German sociologist. His most famous book is The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, about the Protestant work ethic and the emergence of capitalism, how the emergence of modern capitalism, by which he meant actually bourgeois society rather than industrialization, how that was bound up in the Protestant Reformation, in the revolutionizing of Christianity, and the change of its conception of theology and cosmology. So Weber is associated with this term rationalization, also with the concept of bureaucratization as a phenomenon of rationalization. So rationalization, it's a funny kind of concept, meaning it's not just making things rational or making things logical. It's actually about a means-ends reversal. So on the first day of class, we read On Becoming by Marx, the passage from the Grundrisse, where he talked about production being a means versus production being an end in itself. Later, Weber takes this up as an idea and thinks that the modern capitalist world is a function of rationalization, meaning what's important is not the ends towards which we aim, like the goals of what we're doing, but rather the efficiency with which we do things. So the means become an end in themselves. So in the context of capitalism, production becomes pursued not to produce any particular aim or end or goal, but the goal of production is just to improve production. The goal of production is productivity. Adam Smith had this view. That's one aspect of rationalization, which is that the means becomes an end in itself. It's a reversal of means-ends rationality. The other aspect of it is that in capitalism, everything is rational in its particular activity, but overall, the totality is irrational. That's another function of rationalization, which is that the whole is irrational, or treated as irrational. It's treated as chaotic, as entropic, as anomic, meaning following no law, even while every particular activity is done very rationally, logically, and with an aim of greater and greater efficiency. So the idea is that capitalism is rational in its parts, but irrational overall. Irrational as a whole. So that's another problem that's indicated by this term, rationalization. So rationalization is that we make all of our activities very logical, efficient, rational in that sense. But we lose sight of what it's all for. What's the end that we're pursuing? What's the value that we are trying to achieve with all this rational activity, rational in its particulars, rational in its particular aspects? So in that respect, actually what Lukacs is trying to do, part of his dialogue with his old friend, Weber, is that Lukacs is trying to show how Marxism can explain why this is happening. In other words, that rationalization is not a form of its own. It's not its own thing. So Weber understood capitalism as just a function of this process of rationalization. Lukacs is flipping that around and saying, no, rationalization is a function of this process of capitalism. And rationalization is actually an expression of the contradiction, the self-contradictory character of capitalism. So he's trying to use Marxism to explain this phenomenon that Weber had noticed, and that Weber treated as like an inevitable result of history, that there's a kind of, that history is increasingly, over a long period of time, showing this tendency towards rationalization. And it was most advanced, most prominent in the West. However, it could also be found elsewhere. It could be found in China, in the Muslim world, but in the West, it's proceeded the most. We've proceeded the most down this highway of rationalization. Whereas Lukacs says, oh no, that's not just rationalization, that's capitalism, actually. So if that helps explain anything, hopefully it does.
Yeah, that's, that explains it. Well, I noticed that it seemed kind of oxymoronic for the rationalization to appear so obviously irrational, but or the consequence of the rationalization to be so irrational, but yeah, so to continue on that, like, kind of the destroying of communal bonds by specialization in production, so the increased mechanization of workers kind of reduces communities in a way that would not be possible when production was still kind of less specialized, what they call organic here. And that was kind of the point that I thought, at least in my own brain, where rationalization seemed to like lead into reification, where organic relations are shifted to be perceived as inherent properties of humans rather than something formed by the earth, with something that is the product of the society that we built around us. So it seemed like kind of a long way to explain that reification was like a particular form of alienation by capitalism.
Right. So one way of thinking about this is that from the standpoint of bourgeois society, it looks like history is a process by which people become more and more efficient in their activity and therefore more productive. So Marx described it as human nature understood as Homo economicus and Homo faber. So we're the species that makes things, and we're the species that not only makes things, but makes things with increasing efficiency. So beavers make beaver dams, bees make beehives, they collect and process honey, etc. But they do it the same way for millions of years, whereas humans develop our activity historically. We improve this productivity. So Homo faber and Homo economicus. And then the past looks like backwards to us because, the past is just when people produced less and produced less efficiently than we do. So it becomes also a function of technology. So it seems like history is about the development of technology. And by the way, this is what mechanization means. And technology also seems to affect humans. So it's not just humans producing technology, but humans themselves becoming more technological, and in this sense, mechanical. Right? But he wants to say this is the way it appears. It appears that as history progresses, human life becomes more and more mechanical, more and more technologized, more productive, and more efficient. He says, well, no, actually, it's not just productivity and efficiency. Mechanization is the way capitalist development looks. Right, so he's really trying to hold on to the idea that humans could develop and not end up in this mechanical world in which humans are subject to technology. So again, not where technology is a tool that we use, but where humans adapt themselves to technological needs, which are not really technological needs, but are really just the needs of capitalism. Right? So mechanization is not like a natural force, but a specific symptom of capitalism. That's the idea. And also mechanization is contradictory in this way, in the way that we were just talking about with respect to rationalization, which is we become mechanical, which seems that we want regular, predictable activity and outcomes. But there's still the question of what it's all for. In other words, is the goal to just become more efficient and more productive? Towards what end? Right? And that when that end is lost, and when the process itself takes on a life of its own, then it can appear to be a kind of mechanization. The term that we encountered in Marx that's important here is automation. In other words, that human life becomes automated in the sense of programmed. That's what it means to say that it's become mechanical. It's repetitive. And therefore, not really pointing beyond itself, but just pointing to more of the same. Right? And yet there still is this tension. Like, we do subjectively experience this as, what's the point, what is it all for? And we not only experience that as a function of the present, but we also think about all of human history. Like, what is it all amounted to? What is it all for? Where is it going? Is it just going to the ultimate triumph of the machines over the humans, or technology over humanity? Well, that would be very peculiar. How did that happen? Is it because technology and machines are like a force of nature, or is it rather because we've become alienated from our own activity, and the way, therefore, our activity appears to us is in this mechanical, automated form?
Yeah, and that's kind of exactly how, um, like that concept leads into his examples, which you talked about a few of them. I was really interested in his application of reification and rationalization in the world of law
Mm-hmm.
And ethics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so
Right, so
yeah,
what we want out of the law is like a automatic machine
right.
where there's a predictable outcome. We want
Yeah,
statistical regularity and predictability from what should be case-by-case judgments, meaning the original bourgeois ideal of law is that you have to apply the law case by case, exercising judgment, and that it's fallible, right? Whereas now we kind of can't tolerate that, and we want it to just be a kind of automated process, almost like we want computers to make decisions.
right. Yeah. I was thinking of it as kind of a creation of a code for judges to like execute and follow and determine an outcome based on set inputs, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of that also because he used a lot of scientific references or metaphors in his explanations compared to like the more religious ones that we've been seeing in these readings, which I also thought was kind of cool.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, that we could fetishize science. We could engage in what's known as science-ism, meaning we could treat science as if it's a religion.
Mm.
You know, we could have faith in science, or belief in science, or trust in science. Whereas actually science is not really supposed to be based on belief or trust or faith. And yet
Right.
we end up treating it that way. You know, do you believe in God or do you believe in science? Well, it's like, well, wait, actually those are apples and oranges. Right, and he says, you know, interestingly, it looks like religion was all about irrational outcomes. Like the law of primitive societies seems to be flexible and even irrational in character, but that just raises the question of what we mean by rational. What rational means to us now. Right, I think
Yeah.
the quote that you have here is great. The law of primitive societies, which is scarcely altered in hundreds or sometimes even thousands of years, can be flexible and irrational in character, renewing itself with every new legal decision. This is natural law. While modern law, caught up in the continuous turmoil of change, should appear rigid, static, and fixed. All right, that's the paradox or the contradiction. He says, but the paradox dissolves when we realize that it arises only because the same situation has been regarded from two different points of view. On the one hand, from that of the historian who stands outside the actual process, and on the other, from that of someone who experiences the effects of the social order in question and upon his consciousness.
Yeah, I thought that example was, or that quote was really kind of perfect at summarizing that paradox that he was talking about. And then I think soon after that quote, he uses the example of the landscape, which kind of puts it in the perspective of art, which is also helpful for art students. Like
Absolutely.
ourselves, so.
Yep. Yeah, he uses the bourgeois art forms and what has happened to them in capitalism, what has happened to them in modern capitalism. So if we think of, like, painting has a very long history, and there was a time when painting was dominated by history painting, by, like, epic painting, by murals, by sort of historical treatments of the great figures and events of a community, and usually integrated into some kind of political setting or maybe even a religious setting. The more minor genre of painting was what we now call, as opposed to monumental or history painting, easel painting. And the three main genres of easel painting are portraits, still lifes, and landscape. Right, and then those become the main genres of photography as well. So photography is less about history painting and more copying the easel painting. But the easel painting is all about subjectivity. It's all about the painter's subjectivity and the viewer's subjectivity, whereas history painting seems to be more objective because it's about these events and usually about, great processes of history or even divine intervention, the power of God on creation. Whereas this is very much about human subjectivity, but it starts to take on a kind of objective character, meaning landscape was originally about its painting of the land as shaped by humans. So it can include, like, cities architecture, it can include fields, like farming. But that, starting with Romanticism, starting in the early 19th century, starting in the period of the Industrial Revolution, landscape becomes more about, like, nature in itself, or about the tension between nature and human activity. And that, for him, he interprets it as an expression of the emergence of reification, or a more contemplative stance, where the painting seems to be more about objective reality than about the subjectivity of the artist or the viewer. And one could say that achieves its ultimate expression in photography. Because we regard photography as objective, which is peculiar because all that photography is like an automated subjectivity. It's the subjectivity of the artist automated in the form of a machine. Right. The way that I always like to illustrate this is we use photography in court as evidence. Why can't we use painting in court as evidence? Right. We treat photography as true and painting as false. But how is that? Why is that? Why is the machine, which is just an automated human subjectivity, why is that to be trusted more than an eyewitness account, or the representation of an eyewitness account in the form of a drawing or a painting? Why can't that be seen as a true record of an event? Why does it have to be video footage or photographs?
Yeah, and even in photography, like, there's the division of viewing kind of black and white images as more true and more reliable versus the advent of color and how it's changing nowadays. But
yes, that's true, because color still involves a kind of interpretation of color.
Mm-hmm.
Right, color seems to suggest like aesthetic choices that would appear to be less the case with black and white. There are all sorts of paradoxes involved in this. If you kind of dig more deeply into it, it's kind of like, how is that? And again, all that objective means is automated subjectivity. as opposed to like human experience. So again, how is it that these very humanistic art forms became alienated from us, became reified, became about the things in themselves rather than our subjective experience of them?
Yeah. Yeah. And kind of, I guess the last quote that I had kind of ties back into that. Kind of unites all of these separate examples of reification. Where they say, like, the division of labor, which in the case of Taylorism invaded the psyche, here invades the realm of ethics, for the example of law. And then, far from weakening the reified structure of consciousness, this actually strengthens it.
Right. That's right. So Taylorism was an attempt to train workers to use machines in a way that was more efficient, but it was also motivated by the desire to reduce workplace injury and death. So it was an attempt to, discipline the working class to be more efficient, be less wasteful, and that also means, experiencing less injury, including catastrophic injury. And it was meant to really help the workers, but it ended up really serving the function of adapting the workers to the machine. So it's supposed to help the workers use the machine, but it actually ends up being more a function of how the machines use the workers. What we read about in Marx on automation and the machine. How human beings are not really using the machines as tools, but are just servicing the machines in their automated function. The way he puts it in this reification, phenomenon of reification, part 1 section of the reification and the consciousness of the proletariat, is that the condition of the worker becomes that of society as a whole. And that's why we routinely talk about like the system, or we use like mechanical metaphors when describing institutions, right? Because it seems like, in fact, what's going on in any particular technological instance is just a microcosm. It's like a particular instance of a greater phenomenon. Right now, again, with respect to the realm of ethics, it means that we're not like making ethical choices so much as we're adapting ourselves ethically to serve capitalism. Right, so we'll change our ethics to suit capitalism more than we are able to subject capitalism to any kind of ethical direction.
And it seems to me that he's also taking that and going further and saying that is then like affecting our consciousness again, and that becomes an effect that we experience as well.
That's right. That's right. It reinforces it. That's right. Exactly. We feel the overwhelming power of the system over us. Right. So the totality eludes us. A couple of things that he writes here that I want to call attention to. I already pointed out how he bookends this first part of the essay with to be radical means going to the heart of the matter, but for man, the root of the matter, for man the root is man himself. And then at the end, the fantastical creatures on which the world is based. All right, so the world rests on an elephant, but the elephant rests on a turtle, and the turtle rests on a dragon. It's really turtles all the way down. That's one important thought figure, though we have to deal with these things through their form of appearance. There's no actual ability to get at the underlying essence of things. We can only deal with how they appear to us. And so again, it's not it would appear that there's some like essence underneath the mechanization, but no, actually mechanization is the appearance of the essence. And the essence is contradictory and therefore has this contradictory appearance. The others have to do with the nature of alienated consciousness itself. So if you recall from the Max Horkheimer aphorism on the Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom from the first day of class, he says insight is not enough to change the state of affairs. And that's because it's not that the subject is unrecognized, but that the subject does not yet exist, but would have to be created. Meaning it would take a kind of collective political project of subjecting capitalism to political direction. So he says in this essay, he says that the law of value, as Marx lays it out, is actually precisely what we cannot know because of this contradictory nature of capitalism, and that to know it would be tantamount to overcoming it, meaning that we will know how capitalism functions only in the process of overcoming it, only by virtue of overcoming it. A kind of paradoxical idea, but yet very much a Kantian and Hegelian idea, which is that the practical has to come before the theoretical, that we're doing it before we know what we're doing. The other catchphrase that he has is, a new perspective is impossible on the soil of bourgeois society. And by soil he means ground or basis. So a new perspective is not possible on the basis of bourgeois society. And we'll actually be coming back to that tomorrow night because it's where he starts the part 3, the standpoint of the proletariat, part 3 of the Reification essay. So if no new perspective is possible, then what are we dealing with? We're not dealing with a new perspective, we're just dealing with the self-contradictions of the existing perspective. So there's not an alternative to bourgeois consciousness, there's only bourgeois consciousness in its self-contradiction. Meaning, we have to deal with the way things actually appear now to people, and the way they just do spontaneously appear, seemingly objectively. And not imagine that we've achieved a different perspective. Now, here's the interesting part, because to assume that we have an outside perspective on capitalism, to assume that we're outside of it, would itself be a phenomenon of reification, because it would mean that we're contemplating capitalism from outside it, and not as in it and part of it. So the paradox is that in trying to get an outside view on capitalism, that's itself an expression of capitalism. Right. And this is why he's, we'll see in the next section, and then Korsch on Thursday will address this, what they call vulgar Marxism. So there was a crisis in Marxism. Marxism itself became subject to reification, meaning Marxism itself could imagine itself to be a new, different, and better perspective, whereas in fact, it's only the awareness of contradiction within the existing perspective that we have from bourgeois society within capitalism. So what is vulgar Marxism? It's deterministic and objectivistic, meaning that there's been a misinterpretation of Marxism as materialist in this reified sense, in the sense of Marxism is scientific, Marxism is not utopian because it's objective and not subjective. And Lukacs thinks, no, that's actually how Marxism has itself succumbed to reification. When it imagined itself to be outside of capitalism, to have a superior perspective from outside of capitalism, and have a view of capitalism that was scientific in the sense of objective, as opposed to subjective. He says this is the mistake. This is how Marxism itself became reified and ideological and deterministic, meaning that's when Marxism became passive rather than active and expected history to produce socialism as part of an objective process rather than something that had to be achieved through subjective action. So what did he have in mind? This is something that we'll talk about tomorrow, but what he had in mind with respect to this is how the parties of the Second International, the Socialist International, responded to World War I. They responded to it as a accident, as like a mistake, as like a wrong policy on the part of the capitalist governments, as a sort of calamity, a disaster. On the one hand, paradoxically, on the other hand, the same people who treated World War I that way treated the Russian Revolution also as a mistake and as an accident and as an error. So they rejected the Russian Revolution because they judged that objective conditions would not allow for the development of socialism out of the disaster of World War I. Now, let's step back a second. That criticism might have been correct, meaning Russia really struggled to try to produce socialism out of being a devastated country after World War I. Economically backward, largely peasant country. China also experienced something very similar coming out of the disaster of World War II, the disaster of Japanese occupation, and the destruction of that occupation and also of the Civil War between the nationalists and the communists, and also the historical backwardness of being a peasant country. So, again, that it seems like Marxism itself is divided between the subjective and the objective, between a kind of objective determinism and a kind of will to revolution, a will to socialism, a kind of voluntarism, kind of desire for change versus objective conditions that seem to argue against it. And that itself is, from Lukacs' perspective, a phenomenon of reification. That's itself how Marxism became subject to reification. But we'll get more into that tomorrow night, because then that will raise the question of the dialectic of theory and practice. So here we were dealing with the dialectic of subject and object. We will also take that into the realm of theory and practice in the political realm. Meaning, how is the working class's own struggle for socialism, how is the class struggle, and how is the struggle for socialism also a phenomenon of reification? How is it internal to and not external to capitalism? How is it part of the history of capitalism rather than some kind of outside intervention into capitalism? Which is how it could appear. It could appear that the class struggle is an external intervention into capitalism as opposed to being an intrinsic, internal part of the historical process of capitalism. Right, again, the workers' movement for socialism itself, the class struggle itself, divided between an objective phenomenon and a subjective phenomenon. That is in itself is a phenomenon of reification, that division, and that created problems within the movement. It produced controversies, conflicts, debates within the movement itself that tended to fall out along these lines. divorce between theory and practice. That's something that we'll also address with Korsch on Thursday. And a divorce between its subjective and objective character. The objective character of the workers' movement for socialism and its political movement and parties, and its socialist subjective desires. The means and the ends. Right, so there seemed to be a division that developed between the means and the ends of the workers' own class struggle and of the proletarian struggle for socialism. That manifested in World War I. The reason that these parties did not launch a revolution to stop World War I is that they became more concerned about preserving their own organizations in the face of World War I. They didn't want to risk it. They didn't want to risk what they had achieved in building up their movement and building up their parties. They fell into the trap of defending their countries because they saw the threat of external powers, external capitalist state invasion, as threatening their own organizations, their own movement, their own political parties, and social and political power. So there was a phrase by the revisionist, the reformist Edward Bernstein, who I mentioned earlier. He wrote, "The movement is everything and the goal is nothing." And Rosa Luxemburg wrote a famous critique called Reform or Revolution, where she said, but without the goal, the movement is nothing. Without the goal of socialism, the workers' movement is just part of capitalism. So that whole idea of the movement is everything, the goal is nothing, meaning the movement in and of itself is bringing about socialism. There is no goal, and there is no separation of movement from goal. Whereas in fact, no, there is perhaps a distinction and also a contradiction even between the movement and its goal, between the built-up movement and political parties and the task of overcoming capitalism. That in a pinch, in the crisis, maybe these parties are just going to try to preserve themselves rather than risk themselves in the revolution. So they might sacrifice the end to the means. The means might become an end in itself. That's perhaps the most important way in which Marxism succumbed to reification, to this kind of means-ends reversal or rationalization. So the workers' movement, its political parties, the socialist movement became very good at developing its means, but when it came to pursuing its ends, it failed. And what it more did was keep itself going, rather than fulfill its purpose. So again, the means became an end in itself. And that was exemplified by this revisionist motto of the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. Because actually that would describe capitalism itself. Meaning the movement is everything, the goal is nothing, meaning we lose sight of the goal and just engage in the perpetuation of the movement. But this is something that we'll talk about more tomorrow night with the third part of the reification essay. The socialist movement became very good in its organization, but ultimately it lost the plot on its purpose, on its goal. And in this way, it reproduced within itself the problem of capitalism, which is that capitalism also sacrificed the end for the means, for perpetuating the means. All right. Let's adjourn for now. We'll come back. I will announce on Canvas just a reminder that we'll meet at 6:30 tomorrow. So we'll meet 15 minutes early. We'll only be able to meet for an hour because then I have my other conflicting class. This will be the last time that we deal with that. Like I said, we'll do the standpoint to the proletariat. If there's anything left over from that, we'll carry it over to Thursday. But we'll be addressing just this issue of how this problem of reification applies to the working class's struggle for socialism. All right, good night, guys. I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you. We're literally just hanging out, and then some.